Consider the small town of Villisca, Iowa, as it existed in the early hours of June 10th, 1912. A white clapboard house on the corner of 2nd and East Streets stands silent in the darkness. Unremarkable among the other modest dwellings that populate this Midwestern farming community of 2,000 souls, yet within those walls, something unspeakable has occurred. An act so brutal, so methodical in its execution, that it would haunt this rural community for generations and remain one of America's most disturbing, unsolved mass murders. 8 human beings, 6 of them children, lie motionless in their beds, their skulls crushed by repeated blows from an axe while they slept. Their faces, once recognizable to neighbors and loved ones, now rendered unidentifiable masses of tissue and bone. The weapon, a household tool meant for honest labor, left propped against a wall, partially cleaned of the evidence of its grim purpose. This is not merely a crime scene. It is the beginning of a historical mystery that would challenge our understanding of human nature and the limits of forensic investigation at the dawn of the 20th century. The Villisca Axe Murders represent more than a singular act of violence. They constitute a fracture in the perceived safety and innocence of rural American life. A moment when darkness penetrated the heart of a community that believed itself immune to such horrors. As we examine the evidence, piece by piece, we must transport ourselves back to a time before modern criminology, before DNA analysis, before psychological profiling, a time when the most heinous crimes could remain perfect mysteries, their perpetrators vanishing into the fabric of history without a trace. The story that unfolds here is not merely one of murder, but of a fundamental shift in America's perception of safety, community, and the capacity for evil that might exist beneath the most ordinary facades. Our examination begins not with the discovery of the bodies, that grim revelation would come later, but with the events of the evening before, when Josiah and Sarah Moore, along with their 4 children and 2 young guests, attended a Presbyterian church function, completely unaware that in less than a year, than 24 hours, they would become the subjects of one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. The evening of June 9th, 1912, was unremarkable in Villisca. The Moore family, Josiah B. Moore, a prominent businessman, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, 11, Mary, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5, attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, a community celebration where the Moore children performed. They were accompanied by Ina and Lena Stillinger, ages 8 and 12, friends of the Moore children who had been invited to spend the night at the Moore residence. Contemporary accounts describe the program as concluding at 9:30 in the evening, after which the family and their guests returned home, arriving at approximately 9:45 p.m. This mundane detail, a family returning from a church event on a Sunday evening, would later become the starting point for one of the most intensive criminal investigations in Iowa history. The timing of their return home would be scrutinized by investigators attempting to establish a window during which the killer or killers must have entered the home. The church program was witnessed by nearly the entire community, including several individuals who would later fall under suspicion. The Moore family was well regarded in Villisca. Josiah Moore owned a successful implement business and was known for his fair dealing and community involvement. Sarah was described by contemporaries as a devoted mother and active church member. Their children were viewed as well-behaved and bright. The Stillinger girls, daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, who lived on a farm outside of town, were similarly described as pleasant well-mannered children. These were not people known to have enemies. There was no obvious motive for the violence that would befall them. The last confirmed sighting of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls came from Mary Peckham, a neighbor who observed them walking home from the church program. She would later tell investigators that nothing seemed unusual or concerning about their demeanor or the surrounding environment. No strange figures were noticed following them. No unusual sounds were reported in the neighborhood that evening. The family simply returned home, entered their house, and presumably prepared for bed, according to their normal routine. What happened after the Moore family and their guests entered their home on that Sunday evening has been the subject of intense speculation for over a century. Based on forensic evidence gathered at the scene, investigators determined that the family appeared to have gone through their normal bedtime preparations. They had changed into night clothes. The children had brushed their teeth. Some historical accounts suggest that Josiah Moore was known to be methodical about locking his doors at night, though this detail would later be called into question when investigating how the killer gained entry to the home. The layout of the Moore house becomes significant in understanding the events that followed. The two-story structure contained a downstairs with a parlor, sitting room, kitchen, and bedroom where Josiah and Sarah slept. The upstairs contained 3 bedrooms, one for the Moore boys, one for daughter Mary, and a spare room where the Stillinger girls were placed for the night. This arrangement, with the parents sleeping downstairs while all 6 children slept upstairs, would later be considered a factor that may have allowed the killer to systematically move through the house without immediately alerting all occupants. Sometime after the household retired to bed, the precise timing remains unknown. An intruder entered the Moore home. The method of entry remains contested. Some investigators believe the killer entered through an unlocked door or window, while others theorize that the perpetrator may have hidden inside the house before the family returned from the church program, waiting silently for hours until all 8 victims were asleep. The murder weapon was determined to be an axe belonging to Josiah Moore, which had been stored in the family's coal shed. This detail suggested to investigators that the crime was not premeditated, or at least not planned in specific detail, as the killer had not brought a weapon to the scene. The clinical details of what followed represent some of the most disturbing evidence in American crime history. The killer moved methodically through the house, beginning with Josiah and Sarah Moore in their downstairs bedroom. Both were struck multiple times in the head with the blunt end of the axe with such force that their skulls were shattered. Forensic evidence indicated that each victim received between 20 and 30 blows, far more than would have been necessary to cause death. This excessive violence would become one of the crime's most troubling signatures. After killing the parents, the murderer proceeded upstairs where the 6 children slept. Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul Moore were killed in their beds in the same manner as their parents, with crushing blows to the head delivered by the blunt end of the axe. Finally, the killer moved to the guest room where Ina and Lena Stillinger were sleeping. Here, a detail emerged that would later factor into theories about the crime. Lena Stillinger's body was found positioned differently from the others, partially undressed, leading some investigators to speculate about a possible sexual motive. However, medical examination found no evidence of sexual assault on any of the victims. After killing all 8 occupants of the house, the perpetrator engaged in a series of actions that have confounded investigators and psychologists for generations. First, the killer covered all the mirrors in the house and all the windows with clothing or linens from the home. Second, the murderer placed a piece of cloth over the faces of each victim. A basin of bloody water was found in the home, suggesting the killer had washed after completing the crimes. The axe was partially wiped clean before being left leaning against a wall in the downstairs bedroom. Perhaps most disturbing of all, evidence suggested the killer remained in the house for a considerable time after the murders were committed. Food was found in the kitchen that had been partially consumed. A piece of Sarah Moore's undergarment was used to wipe the axe handle. A 2-pound slab of uncooked bacon was removed from the icebox and left wrapped in cloth on the kitchen table. Another slab of bacon was found in the bedroom where the Stillinger girls had been killed. These details have led criminal psychologists to suggest the perpetrator exhibited behavior consistent with what would later be classified as a psychopathic personality, showing no remorse or urgency to flee after committing acts of extreme violence. The killer could have remained in the house for hours after the murders, perhaps all night, in the company of his victims. The Moore family and their guests were not discovered until the following morning. Mary Peckham, the neighbor who had witnessed their return from church the previous evening, became concerned when she noticed no activity at the Moore house throughout the morning of June 10th. It was unusual for the industrious household not to have smoke coming from the chimney or for Sarah Moore not to be out hanging laundry. At approximately 7 a.m., Peckham approached the house and knocked on the door. Receiving no answer, she tried the door and found it locked. This detail would later contribute to the mystery of how the killer had departed the residence, as it suggested they had exited through a door and locked it behind them, potentially using a key. Increasingly concerned, Peckham called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. Upon his arrival, Ross used his copy of the house key to enter the residence. He proceeded only as far as the downstairs bedroom door, where he discovered the bodies of Josiah and Sarah Moore. Ross immediately backed out of the house and contacted Villisca City Marshal Hank Horton. The discovery of the bodies set in motion a series of events that would forever change the community of Villisca and establish a template for how not to conduct a murder investigation. Marshal Horton's actions upon entering the crime scene have been widely criticized by modern forensic standards. He immediately allowed dozens of townspeople to enter the house and view the bodies, effectively contaminating what would now be considered crucial evidence. By some accounts, more than 100 individuals walked through the Moore house on the day the bodies were discovered, touching objects, moving through rooms, and fundamentally altering the crime scene. Fingerprint analysis, still in its infancy as an investigative technique in 1912, was rendered virtually impossible by the parade of onlookers through the house. Potential evidence was disrupted, moved, or removed entirely as souvenirs by macabre curiosity seekers. Even the investigation's initial documentation was compromised by this chaotic response. The bodies were removed to a local funeral home before a thorough examination of their positions and the surrounding evidence could be properly catalogued. The contemporary investigation's shortcomings were not limited to the mishandling of the crime scene. Initial investigative efforts focused almost exclusively on individuals with a known connection to the Moore family, failing to consider the possibility that the crime might have been committed by a stranger or itinerant killer. This tunnel vision would hamper the investigation for years. News of the murders spread rapidly throughout Iowa and across the nation. The brutality of the crime, particularly the murder of 6 children, captured the public imagination and generated widespread fear. The Des Moines Register described it as the greatest murder mystery in the Middle West, while other publications compared the brutality to the infamous Jack the Ripper murders in London. Within days of the discovery, Villisca was inundated with journalists, private detectives, and the merely curious. The investigation quickly expanded beyond local law enforcement. The Moore family's prominence and the shocking nature of the crime led to the involvement of multiple agencies, including private detective agencies hired by both the state of Iowa and the Burlington Railroad, which was concerned about the impact of the murders on passenger traffic. The most notable detective assigned to the case was James Newton Wilkerson, a former railroad detective hired by a citizens' committee in Villisca. Wilkerson's investigation would eventually focus on a prominent local businessman, Frank F. Jones, for whom Josiah Moore had previously worked before establishing his own competing business. Wilkerson theorized that business rivalry and personal animosity might have motivated the crime. The Jones theory gained traction when investigators learned that Jones had allegedly threatened Moore over business disputes and that Moore had been involved in an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. However, no physical evidence ever linked Jones to the crime scene, and he maintained his innocence throughout multiple inquiries. Another significant suspect emerged in the form of Reverend George Kelly, an English-born traveling minister who had been in Villisca on the day of the murders and had attended the same church program as the Moore family. Kelly's interest in the case bordered on obsession. He repeatedly inserted himself into the investigation and wrote numerous letters about the murders to investigators, journalists, and even the victims' family members. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested and charged with the crime after allegedly confessing. However, the confession was obtained under highly questionable circumstances following a lengthy interrogation. Kelly later recanted, claiming he had been coerced. His first trial ended in a hung jury, and he was acquitted in a second trial. Despite the acquittal, suspicion continued to follow Kelly, particularly due to his peculiar behavior and detailed knowledge of the crime scene. Modern analysis of Kelly's background, writings, and behavior suggests he may have suffered from mental illness and exhibited voyeuristic tendencies. But whether these traits translated into murderous violence remains speculative. A third significant suspect was William Blackie Mansfield, a serial killer believed to be responsible for at least 2 similar axe murder attacks in Illinois. Like the Villisca case, these attacks involved whole families being murdered in their sleep with an axe. Mansfield's potential connection to Villisca was strengthened by evidence that he had been in the area around the time of the murders. Detective Wilkerson, after initially focusing on Frank Jones, later shifted his attention to Mansfield, going so far as to suggest that Jones might have hired Mansfield to commit the murders. However, Mansfield was eventually eliminated as a suspect when employment records appeared to provide him with an alibi, showing he was working in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. Modern researchers have questioned the validity of this alibi, noting inconsistencies in the records and the relative ease with which such documentation could have been falsified in 1912. Beyond these 3 primary suspects, the investigation considered dozens of other individuals with varying degrees of thoroughness. These included transients passing through Villisca, individuals with known violent histories, and even family members of the victims. Each lead eventually dissolved into speculation without sufficient evidence to support prosecution. As the initial investigation stalled, the community of Villisca began to experience the long-term effects of having such a horrific, unsolved crime in its midst. The social fabric of the town was strained by suspicion, fear, and the ongoing presence of outsiders involved in the investigation. Property values declined, and some residents chose to leave the area entirely rather than live in the shadow of the murders. The Moore house itself became a place of morbid fascination, standing empty for many years before eventually being purchased and occupied by new residents, apparently undeterred by its violent history. The lack of closure in the Villisca Axe Murders case has contributed to its enduring place in American crime history. Unlike many historical crimes that fade from public consciousness as participants and witnesses die, the Villisca case has maintained a persistent grip on the national imagination. This is partly due to the extraordinary violence involved, partly due to the victims, including 6 children, and partly due to the tantalizing array of suspects and theories that have never been definitively resolved. The continuing fascination with the case has also been fueled by suggestions that the Villisca murders might be connected to a series of similar crimes that occurred across the Midwest between 1911 and 1912. These include multiple incidents of families being murdered in their beds with an axe in Colorado, Illinois, Kansas, and Iowa. The pattern is striking. Families were killed at night, mirrors were covered, and the killer often lingered at the scene. Criminal historians have suggested these crimes may represent the work of one of America's earliest documented serial killers, operating along the expanding railway system that connected previously isolated communities. The investigation into potential connections between these cases was hampered by the limited communication between law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions during this period. Without a centralized database or regular information sharing, detectives in each location largely worked in isolation, unaware of potentially crucial patterns emerging across state lines. It wasn't until decades later that researchers began to systematically compare the details of these cases and identify their similarities. The possibility that the Villisca murders were part of a larger pattern of serial killings adds another layer of complexity to an already confounding case. If the perpetrator was a transient killer moving along rail lines, it would explain the lack of obvious connection to the victims and the absence of a clear motive. It would also explain why the killer was never identified in Villisca. He may have simply moved on to another community, perhaps continuing his pattern of violence elsewhere. The psychological profile that emerges from the Villisca crime scene details suggests a perpetrator with specific behavioral characteristics that would now be recognized as consistent with certain types of serial killers. The excessive violence used against the victims, particularly the repeated blows to the faces, indicates rage or a desire to obliterate identity. The covering of mirrors might suggest a killer who didn't want to see his own reflection after committing such acts. The lingering at the crime scene, consuming food, and the ritualistic covering of the victims' faces with cloth are behaviors that indicate a killer who derived psychological satisfaction from controlling the environment after the murders were completed. Modern forensic psychologists who have studied the case suggest the perpetrator likely exhibited psychopathic traits, including lack of empathy, methodical planning, and the ability to appear normal in everyday interactions. The killer would have needed to maintain sufficient composure to enter and exit the community without drawing attention, suggesting someone capable of compartmentalizing extremely violent behavior. Criminologists have noted that the methodical nature of the killings, striking each victim in the head in a similar manner, ensuring no victim escaped, indicates planning and a level of comfort with extreme violence that would be unusual in a first-time offender. This observation supports the serial killer theory, suggesting the Villisca murders may not have been the perpetrator's first act of violence. The technological limitations of early 20th century forensic science severely hampered the investigation. Blood typing was in its infancy, DNA analysis lay decades in the future, and fingerprinting was not yet systematically applied to crime scenes in rural America. Had the Villisca murders occurred in the modern era, Investigators would have had access to tools that might have definitively identified the killer from evidence left at the scene. Even with these limitations, contemporary investigators did make efforts to apply the forensic techniques available to them. The axe was examined for fingerprints, though the partial wiping of the weapon and the subsequent handling by multiple individuals rendered this effort largely ineffective. Blood evidence was noted, but could not be typed or matched to specific individuals with the technology of 1912. Footprints and other physical evidence from the scene were documented, but without comparative samples or a systematic database, they provided limited investigative value. The Villisca Axe murders occurred at a pivotal moment in the development of American law enforcement and forensic science. The case illustrates the transition from 19th-century investigative methods, which relied heavily on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, to more modern approaches incorporating physical evidence and forensic analysis. The shortcomings of the Villisca investigation would later influence the development of standardized crime scene procedures designed to preserve evidence and limit contamination. The case also reflects broader social dynamics of early 20th century America. The intense focus on suspects with known connections to the victims, rather than considering the possibility of a stranger or transient killer, reflects the prevailing belief that such extreme violence must arise from personal grievance, rather than random malice. This assumption may have directed investigative resources away from potentially fruitful avenues of inquiry. The Villisca murders also occurred during a period of significant social and economic change in rural America. The expansion of the railroad system had connected previously isolated communities, increasing mobility and anonymity in a society that had previously relied on personal familiarity as a form of social control. The possibility that the killer arrived and departed by train, anonymous among the many travelers passing through Villisca, represented a new kind of threat to public safety that local law enforcement was ill-equipped to address. As the decades passed without resolution, the Villisca Axe murders transitioned from an active investigation to a historical mystery. The physical evidence was lost or deteriorated, witnesses died, and the procedural failures of the initial investigation ensured that many potentially crucial details were never properly documented. Yet the case has never completely faded from public consciousness. Each generation has approached the mystery with new analytical tools and perspectives, looking for insights that previous investigators might have missed. In the 1930s and 1940s, true crime publications revisited the case, often emphasizing its more sensational aspects while glossing over investigative complexities. During the 1960s and 1970s, as criminal psychology developed as a field, new analyses of the killer's potential motivations and psychological profile emerged. By the 1990s, with the advent of criminal profiling and more sophisticated understandings of serial killer behavior, researchers began more systematically comparing the Villisca murders to similar cases from the same time period, strengthening the serial killer theory. Today, the Moore House stands restored to its 1912 appearance, operating as a museum and reportedly one of the most haunted locations in the Midwest, according to paranormal enthusiasts. Visitors report unexplained sounds, moving objects, and feelings of overwhelming sadness or fear. While such reports fall outside the realm of forensic evidence, they speak to the emotional imprint the murders left on the location and the community. The psychological impact of such an extreme act of violence, particularly one that remains unresolved, continues to reverberate through generations of Villisca residents. The descendants of both victims and suspects have had to contend with the case's legacy, navigating the complex emotional terrain of being connected to a notorious historical crime. The Moore family graves in Villisca Cemetery continue to receive visitors, many leaving toys or flowers for the murdered children. A poignant reminder of the human tragedy at the heart of this historical mystery. Historians studying the case have noted how the Villisca murders shattered the presumed safety of rural American life. Before June 10, 1912, residents of small Midwestern towns generally left doors unlocked and windows open, considering themselves immune to the types of violence associated with urban environments. After the murders, that sense of security was irreparably damaged. Locks, security measures, and a general wariness of strangers became more common in communities that had previously operated on implicit trust. The enduring fascination with the Villisca Axe Murders represents more than morbid curiosity. It speaks to our collective discomfort with unresolved questions, particularly those involving violence of such magnitude. The human mind seeks patterns, explanations, and closure. The Villisca case, with its brutal details and tantalizing array of suspects, but no definitive answers, challenges our desire for narrative completion. Each theory about the identity of the killer, Frank Jones acting on business rivalry, Reverend Kelly following disturbed impulses, William Mansfield as a transient serial killer, or one of the many other suspects considered over the years, offers a potential resolution to the mystery. Yet none has provided the conclusive evidence necessary to close the case with certainty. Modern forensic techniques have offered limited assistance in resolving the Villisca mystery. Unlike some cold cases where preserved DNA evidence has identified perpetrators decades after the crime, the physical evidence from the Moore house was not preserved in a manner that would allow for modern analysis. The axe, bedding, and other items that might have contained the killer's DNA were handled by numerous individuals and eventually lost to time. The bodies were buried shortly after cursory examinations, without the extensive collection and preservation of evidence that would be standard procedure today. Some researchers have suggested that cemetery records could theoretically allow for exhumation and examination of the victims using modern forensic techniques. But ethical considerations and respect for the deceased have precluded such approaches. Instead, contemporary research into the case has focused on historical records, newspaper accounts, and the documented patterns of similar crimes from the same period. The Villisca Axe Murders represent a pivotal case in the development of American crime investigation, illustrating both the limitations of early 20th century forensic methods and the enduring public fascination with unsolved mysteries. The case stands as a grim milestone in the evolution of rural American society, marking a transition from assumed safety to recognition of vulnerability. For those who continue to study the case, the central question remains unchanged after more than a century. Who entered the Moore house on that June night in 1912, axe in hand, with the intention of obliterating an entire household? Was it a business rival seeking revenge? A disturbed minister acting on twisted impulses? A methodical serial killer working his way across the Midwest? Or someone else entirely, a suspect perhaps never seriously considered by investigators? The answer lies buried with the victims, an enduring mystery that continues to cast its shadow over the small town of Villisca, Iowa. As daylight faded on June 9, 1912, 8 individuals prepared for bed in a white clapboard house, unaware they would never see another sunrise. By morning, their deaths would launch an investigation spanning generations, a mystery that would resist resolution despite the efforts of countless detectives, researchers, and amateur sleuths fascinated by one of America's most disturbing unsolved crimes. The Villisca Axe Murders remain a dark enigma in our national history, a case where the questions continue to outnumber the answers, and where the passage of time has obscured rather than illuminated the path to truth. The White House on the corner of 2nd and East Streets still stands as a silent witness to that night of violence, holding secrets that may never be revealed, challenging each new generation to confront the possibility that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved. To more fully comprehend the magnitude of the Villisca tragedy, we must examine not only the crime itself, but also its place within the cultural and historical context of early 20th century America. The year 1912 marked a transitional period in American society. The Victorian era had given way to the Progressive era, characterized by technological advancement, social reform, and changing cultural norms. Villisca, despite its small size and rural location, was not immune to these broader social shifts. The town had recently gained access to telephone service. Automobiles, though still rare, were beginning to appear on local roads. The railroad connected Villisca to larger urban centers, bringing with it commerce, travelers, and the influences of the wider world. These modernizing forces were juxtaposed against the traditional, close-knit nature of small-town life, creating a community that stood at the intersection of old and new America. This context is crucial for understanding the profound psychological impact of the murders on the collective consciousness of Villisca and similar communities across the nation. The Moore family itself reflected this transitional period. Josiah Moore, at 43, had risen from humble beginnings to become a respected businessman, owning the implement store that supplied essential tools and equipment to local farmers. His success story embodied the American ideal of upward mobility through hard work and enterprise. Sarah Moore, 39, managed their household with efficiency and care, while also participating actively in community and church affairs. Their children represented the promise of the future. Bright, well-mannered young people receiving the benefits of education and stable family life that would prepare them for adulthood in the new century. The Stillinger sisters, similarly, came from a respectable farming family that exemplified the agricultural backbone of Midwestern society. These were not marginal figures, but rather central representatives of rural American life, which perhaps explains why their murders generated such widespread shock and attention. The investigation of the crime reveals much about the state of American law enforcement in 1912. Police work was still largely localized, with limited coordination between jurisdictions. Forensic science, though developing in major urban centers, had not yet penetrated to rural departments. Marshall Horton, Villisca's primary law enforcement officer, had likely never encountered a murder case before, much less one of such complexity and brutality. His decision to allow townsfolk to enter the crime scene, while appalling by modern standards, reflected both the lack of established protocols for evidence preservation and the communal nature of small-town governance, where public participation was often expected rather than prohibited. The investigation also laid bare the class and social divides within the seemingly homogeneous community. Frank Jones, as a prominent businessman and former state senator, represented the local elite. His potential involvement in the crime became a focal point, partly because of existing tensions between established power structures and the rising middle class represented by Josiah Moore. The consideration of Reverend Kelly as a suspect similarly reflected anxieties about religious authority and the potential for moral corruption beneath respectable exteriors. The suspicion of William Mansfield, a laborer and drifter, aligned with growing concerns about transient populations and the anonymity afforded by increasing mobility in American society. Each suspect, in their way, embodied a different aspect of early 20th century social anxiety. The crime occurred against a backdrop of other significant events that shaped American consciousness. Just 2 months prior, in April 1912, the Titanic had sunk in the North Atlantic, challenging notions of technological infallibility and human mastery over nature. That same year, Woodrow Wilson would be elected president on a progressive platform, signaling shifts in the political landscape. Labor disputes and industrial accidents regularly made headlines, highlighting the human costs of rapid industrialization. Within this turbulent context, the Villisca murders became emblematic of a different kind of vulnerability. The possibility that even in the supposed safety of one's own home, in a peaceful rural community, unimaginable violence could strike without warning or apparent reason. The investigation into the Villisca murders spanned multiple decades, with periodic resurgences of interest and activity. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, as forensic science advanced and criminology developed as a discipline, various experts reviewed the case files and offered new interpretations. Some focused on psychological profiles of the killer, while others attempted to establish connections between the Villisca case and similar crimes throughout the region. In 1931, nearly 2 decades after the murders, a grand jury was convened to reconsider the evidence against Frank Jones, though no indictment was issued. The 1940s brought renewed attention when a series of articles in true crime publications suggested connections between the Villisca murders and other unsolved axe murders in the Midwest. The timing of these publications is noteworthy. Coinciding with America's entry into World War II and a period of national anxiety about external threats and internal security. The Villisca case, with its implications of hidden dangers in seemingly safe environments, resonated with these broader cultural concerns. In the 1950s, with most of the original investigators and witnesses deceased, the case receded somewhat from public consciousness, becoming more historical curiosity than active investigation. However, the 1960s and 1970s saw another revival of interest, particularly among a new generation of criminologists applying more sophisticated analytical techniques to historical cases. This period also marked the beginning of the true crime genre as a popular form of entertainment and education, with the Villisca case featured in numerous books, articles, and later, documentary films. By the end of the 20th century, the Moore House had taken on a new role in the community and national consciousness. Purchased in 1994 by Darwin and Martha Lynn, the house was carefully restored to its 1912 appearance and opened as a museum. This transformation from crime scene to historical site and tourist attraction represents a complex negotiation between commemoration, education, and commodification of tragedy. Visitors to the house today encounter a meticulously preserved time capsule of early 20th century domestic life, while also confronting the dark history that occurred within those walls. The restoration of the house coincided with a broader cultural fascination with unsolved historical crimes and paranormal phenomena. Since its opening as a museum, the Moore House has been featured in numerous television programs focusing on allegedly haunted locations. Paranormal investigators have conducted sessions in the house, reporting unusual recordings, temperature fluctuations, and other phenomena that they interpret as evidence of spiritual activity. These investigations represent yet another layer of engagement with the tragedy, one that seeks meaning and resolution through frameworks outside conventional historical or criminological analysis. Whether one views these paranormal investigations as sincere attempts to access historical truths through non-traditional means or as exploitation of tragedy for entertainment, they undeniably contribute to the ongoing cultural significance of the Villisca case. Beyond the specifics of the crime and investigation, the Villisca Axe Murders have assumed a place in American folklore and cultural memory that transcends their historical significance. They have become a cautionary tale, a ghost story, a mystery that resists solution, and therefore invites endless retelling and reinterpretation. Each generation approaches the case with its own preoccupations and analytical frameworks, finding in the details reflections of contemporary concerns about violence, security, justice, and the unknown. For historians and criminologists, the case provides a window into early 20th century American society, law enforcement practices, and the limitations of forensic science at that time. For psychologists and behavioral analysts, the crime scene details offer insights into the mind of a killer whose identity remains unknown, but whose actions speak to specific pathologies. For the community of Villisca itself, the murders represent both a historical trauma and a defining characteristic that shapes the town's identity and relationship with the outside world. The enduring fascination with the case also raises ethical questions about how we remember and represent historical tragedies. The transformation of the Moore House into a tourist destination, complete with overnight stays offered to paying guests, creates a complex intersection of commemoration, education, and commercialization. Visitors who sleep in the rooms where the Moore family and Stillinger girls were murdered engage in a form of historical immersion that blurs the boundaries between respectful remembrance and voyeuristic consumption of tragedy. This commercialization of the crime scene is not unique to Villisca. Similar sites associated with notorious crimes have become tourist attractions across America and beyond. This phenomenon reflects broader cultural attitudes toward historical violence, where the passage of time seems to transform real human suffering into acceptable entertainment or educational experience. As we reflect on the Villisca Axe Murders from our vantage point more than a century later, we are reminded of the limitations of historical knowledge and the persistent human desire for narrative closure. Despite extensive investigation, sophisticated analysis, and the application of modern psychological and criminological frameworks to the evidence, we remain unable to state with certainty who committed these murders or why. This absence of resolution challenges our contemporary expectations of forensic certainty and judicial closure, reminding us that some mysteries resist our most determined efforts at solution. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Villisca Axe Murders lies not in the specifics of the crime or the identity of the perpetrator, but in what the case reveals about our collective relationship with historical violence and unsolved mysteries. The persistent fascination with this century-old crime speaks to something fundamental in human nature: our need to make sense of seemingly senseless violence, to impose narrative order on chaotic events, and to believe that even the most disturbing mysteries can eventually be solved through sufficient determination and analytical skill. The fact that the Villisca case continues to resist definitive solution despite generations of investigation serves as a humbling reminder of the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of the unknown in our ordered world. The white clapboard house on the corner of 2nd and East Streets stands today as a physical embodiment of this unresolved mystery, a place where past and present intersect, where the boundaries between history, tragedy, and folklore blur. It remains a silent witness to events that occurred on that June night in 1912. Events that transformed 8 ordinary lives into enduring symbols of vulnerability, violence, and the elusive nature of truth in human affairs. As each new generation encounters the story of the Villisca Axe Murders, they bring their own perspectives, analytical tools, and cultural preoccupations to bear on this historical mystery. Yet the essential questions remain unchanged. Who entered the Moore house on that summer night, axe in hand? What combination of psychological factors, circumstances, and intentions led to such extraordinary violence? And perhaps most disturbingly, how many other crimes of similar brutality remain unsolved? Their perpetrators having escaped justice through the limitations of forensic science, the passage of time, or simple luck. These questions, like the murders themselves, will likely continue to haunt us, challenging our assumption that with sufficient technology, expertise, and determination, all mysteries can be solved and all criminals brought to justice. The Villisca Axe Murders remind us that some aspects of the human experience remain stubbornly resistant to explanation. Some truths remain permanently beyond our reach, and some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved.